There are vaults in this city built not of steel, but of silence. The kind of silence that blooms beneath graveyards and perfumes itself with orchids. When a grieving widow walks through the wrong door and a senator's past begins to stir, the truth doesn't knock. It blooms, deadly and deliberate. What begins with a black flower ends with a trail of buried secrets, and every step closer to justice digs deeper into the dirt. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. I've seen Nero Wolfe in moods ranging from pompous to volcanic, but the sound I heard that morning from the plant rooms was a new category. Orchid emergency, level crimson. It wasn't a shout exactly, more of a bellow, filtered through contempt. "Fritz!" it echoed. "Theodore! Immediately!" Since Wolfe typically prefers to summon people with the vocal restraint of a Gregorian monk, I set down my coffee and strolled toward the plant rooms like a man heading into a storm cellar without an umbrella. Fritz nearly collided with me in the hallway, wiping his hands on his apron like a chef about to be tried at The Hague. Theodore trailed behind, looking pale enough to blend into a greenhouse wall. They disappeared into the hallowed space where Wolfe kept his orchids and his mood swings, and I loitered just close enough to hear snippets. "It is gone," Wolfe said, full of gravel and doom. "The Oncidium papilio hybrid, the one I had isolated 3 weeks ago." Theodore made a sound somewhere between a hiccup and a sob. "Vanished," Wolfe spat, "from a locked case." Which meant either the orchids were staging a prison break, or someone had crossed a line Wolfe considered sacred. I didn't know it yet, but the real trouble hadn't bloomed yet. This was just the first lost flower. By the time Wolfe stormed into the dining room, he looked like a Baroque thundercloud in a housecoat. His lips were pressed into a line of disapproval so sharp it could have trimmed hedges. I was on my second cup of coffee, pretending not to watch Fritz mince shallots like they'd insulted his ancestry. "I have tolerated many indignant—" "Assure you, then explain," Wolfe said coldly, "why my Oncidium is gone." Nobody had an answer, and I didn't either, at least not yet. It wasn't the ideal moment to chime in, but I've always had a weakness for inconvenient timing. I leaned against the frame of the kitchen doorway, arms folded. "I don't want to distract from the floral inquisition," I said, "but if we're taking inventory of strange happenings, I've got one." Wolfe scowled. "Speak, if you must." "This morning," I said, "around 4:30. Couldn't sleep. Took a walk. I passed Gramercy Cemetery and spotted a man, tall, wiry, wearing a dark funeral suit. He was pacing, alone. No flowers, no dog, no obvious mourning credentials. Fritz turned to me, eyes wide. "In the cemetery?" "Yep," I said. Didn't look drunk. Didn't look lost. Just waiting. Or maybe counting gravestones. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but his body stilled, like someone had snapped a chalk line through his thoughts. "At that hour," he said softly. Dead quiet. No pun intended, I added. Theodore, who had recovered enough to sip water, gave a visible shudder. Wolfe looked at me. "Did he notice you?" "I don't think so." "Describe him." I did, but it didn't move the needle on Wolfe's forehead. He went silent again, but not the lazy kind, the thinking kind. The kind that usually meant we were about to meet someone interesting. When Nero Wolfe refuses breakfast, it's not just news. It's cause for citywide alert. Fritz had plated the usual, soft-boiled eggs, fresh-baked rolls, that ridiculous Austrian butter Wolfe claimed tasted like civilization. Wolfe took one look, growled something in untranslated Latin, and stomped back to the plant rooms. I sat alone at the table, eyeing my eggs like they owed me an apology. From the kitchen, Fritz wrung his hands and whispered, "He did not even smell the butter." "He's mourning," I said. "Leave him to it." Wolfe's voice floated back through the hallway. "This is not mourning, Mr. Goodwin. This is rage at intellectual vandalism." Which I took to mean someone had either stolen an orchid or rearranged his Oxford commas. The rest of the breakfast was quiet, except for the soft clink of fork against porcelain. I had a feeling it wouldn't stay that way long. The phone rang at 9:07 a.m., and I beat Fritz to it by half a stride. His nerves were still fried from the truffle scare, so I gave him a break. "Nero Wolfe's residence," I said, smooth as creme anglaise. "Archie Goodwin speaking." The voice on the other end was female, mid-30s by the sound of it, sharp enough to slice through upholstery. "I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe. Immediately." "Name?" "No, not optional." "I'm not being dramatic," she said, ignoring me. "But something was buried that shouldn't have been. And now it's gone." My eyebrows did a slow ascent. "Who am I speaking with?" Pause. "Just tell him this. The grave at Calvary. Someone's been there. I don't know who yet, but it wasn't vandals. And it wasn't random." "Lady," I said, "this is a detective agency, not a séance." She hung up. I turned to Wolfe, who was standing 10 feet away, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised like he'd heard every word. "Something was buried that shouldn't have been," he repeated. "Yep." His voice was dry as dust. How charmingly cryptic. I was going to offer a snide remark, but then the phone rang again. It wasn't her. Wolfe didn't say anything for a solid 2 minutes, which, in his world, is a minor geological era. I watched the tension in his jaw build to a slow simmer while he rearranged orchid vials on the table like chess pieces. Then he spoke. "You will answer the door at precisely 8:45 this evening," he said. I blinked. "To whom?" "To our visitor, of course. The woman you're inviting in a nameless voice from a phone call who refuses to identify herself, won't leave a number, and talks like a bad Poe story. She possesses mystery, maybe even murder. At precisely 8:45, no sooner, no later, the front doorbell chimed with a kind of musical dread. I opened it to find a woman whose entrance didn't require an introduction or an explanation. She was about 45, maybe 50 if the lighting wasn't on her side, but her posture didn't ask for favors, and her storm grey hat matched her expression. Elegant, composed, and clearly the kind of widow who'd buried more than just a husband. She offered a smile that could have sliced ham. "Mr. Wolfe is expecting me." "He is," I said. Whether he's ready is another question. In the office, Wolfe was seated in his throne, arms folded, lips pursed, face arranged in the expression he usually reserved for politicians and menu substitutions. "Mrs. Martindale," he intoned, "be seated." She didn't blink at the tone, just crossed the room, sat in the red chair across from him, and pulled off her gloves like she was about to testify before a Senate subcommittee. "I'll get right to it, Mr. Wolfe," she said. "My husband is dead, but his grave isn't quiet." I raised a brow and reached for my notebook. Wolfe didn't move, but I could tell she had his full attention. "My husband," she began, voice smooth but threaded with steel, "was Raymond Martindale, the architect." Wolfe nodded once. "I recall the name. You are recently widowed?" 6 months, she said. "And every Monday since, I've visited his grave at Calvary." "Commendable," Wolfe murmured, without a trace of warmth. "Continue." She adjusted her handbag like it contained diplomatic secrets. "Last Monday, The headstone had shifted. Not by much, maybe 2 inches clockwise, but enough for me to notice. "You're certain?" I asked. Her eyes flicked to me. "I don't wear heels to cemeteries, Mr. Goodwin. I kneel. I pray. I notice." Wolfe cleared his throat. "Go on." There was also disturbed soil, fresh. Someone had dug and covered it back up. Not carefully. "Vandals?" I offered.
She shook her head. Nothing else was touched. The flowers were still there, the plaque untouched. It wasn't mischief, Mr. Wolfe. Wolfe's eyes narrowed slightly. Then what, Mrs. Martindale, was the target? She hesitated, just long enough to spark the first flicker of suspicion in Wolfe's expression. "My husband," she said finally, "was buried with something. Something that may have drawn attention." Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. "Indeed." I leaned back. The air in the room had gotten heavier, and we were just getting started. "A few weeks before he died," she continued, "Raymond said something odd." Offhand but serious, Wolfe grunted. "Go on." She folded her hands. "He said if I'm buried with it, someone will come looking." "Vague," Wolfe commented. "Dramatic," I added. She ignored both of us. I asked what he meant. He only smiled. He liked riddles. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, as if the word riddles had caused him indigestion. "Your husband was in full possession of his faculties at the time." "He was many things," she replied crisply, "but never senile." "Then he buried something deliberately," Wolfe muttered. "A provocation." I scratched my chin. "Or bait." Sylvia met my eyes. "He called it protection." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Protection from what, Mrs. Martindale?" She hesitated. "Or whom?" I said. Still silence. I jotted a note I had no intention of showing Wolfe. This one knows more than she says. And if Wolfe agreed, which I suspected he did, he was already 10 moves ahead. "It was a small brass case," she said, flat, maybe 5 by 3 inches, heavy. "A relic?" Wolfe asked. "A container," she corrected, "with a map." Folded tightly inside, I perked up. "Map of what?" She took a breath. "I never saw it, but Raymond mentioned it once. He said it was encoded, old-school cipher, not modern encryption, something only he could read." Wolfe leaned forward slightly. "You are implying your husband buried a coded map with his own corpse." "I'm stating it," she replied. "He thought it safer there than in any safe or vault." Wolfe grunted. "Imbecilic." "Maybe, but effective." Slowly. "Is Julian Lochner?" Wolfe's lips pursed like someone had served him canned soup. The name is distastefully familiar. I chuckled. "Architect, tall, tan, and too slick by half. Partnered with your husband for a decade before they split over something to do with city permits." "Something," she said, "called corruption," my husband pulled out. Lochner didn't. "Motivation?" Wolfe asked. "Money," she said simply. "Raymond cut him out of a dozen projects before he died." "And if there was a vault," I added, "Lochner might think it's his compensation plan." Exactly. Wolfe's eyelids drooped, which meant he was already constructing something brutal and logical. I knew the look. I jotted Lochner's name in my book with a double underline. Some names echo. That one clanged like a dropped crowbar, and for Wolfe, it was enough to move the needle. She reached into her handbag and retrieved an envelope, thick, cream-coloured, and crisp enough to suggest it hadn't been touched by human hands since the stationery store. "I assume you require a retainer," she said. "You assume correctly," Wolfe replied. She handed it to him. He didn't open it, just weighed it in one hand, then nodded and slipped it into the drawer to the right of his chair. The cash drawer, the sacred one. "I want to know who disturbed my husband's grave," she said, "and why." "You understand," Wolfe said, "that we are not merely dealing with a matter of vandalism. This may evolve into criminal enterprise, possibly homicide." "I'm aware," she said. "I married Raymond Martindale. I lived with secrets. Now I want truth."
Wolfe's eyes narrowed. You may not like it. I'm not paying for comfort. With that, she stood and offered a tight smile. Contact me when you have progress. She left behind a perfume trace, something subtle, expensive, and strangely hollow. That evening, I put on my lightweight overcoat and followed Julian Lochner from his glossy office in Midtown to a jazz bar near the West 40s. He drank club soda, watched the pianist like he was reading sheet music in Braille, and left without speaking to anyone. After that, he strolled past 2 bookstores, paused outside a pawn shop, and then slipped into a brownstone near the river. I hadn't seen since a wiretap case in '43. By the time he re-emerged, the moon was up, and my feet were lobbying for early retirement. I got back to the brownstone a few minutes after 10. The stoop was quiet, the air mild, and the door? Pinned dead center, with a silver tack, was a single black rose. Artificial, silk, but carefully twisted, and bent at the stem like it had been strangled. I plucked it off and stood there a moment. Inside, Wolfe was waiting, and I was sure. So was something else. Most people associate cemeteries with grief, quiet contemplation, and uncomfortable shoes. I associate them with dead ends and worse coffee. But at 10:43 the next morning, I was standing at the Calvary Cemetery gates with a lukewarm cup in my hand, trying not to look like a guy planning to dig something up. Wolfe hadn't given an order. He'd barely grunted after Sylvia Martindale left. But I knew a mood when I saw one. And this one came with a hint of unfinished grave business. The place was a maze of marble and solemnity, with enough headstones to make you believe New York had been burying secrets longer than it had been building skyscrapers. I figured if someone had been pacing around the place at 4:30 in the morning, it might not have been for sentimental reasons. I started with the row I'd spotted the man near the day before. The grass was neatly trimmed, no signs of fresh footprints. But I didn't have to wait long before something stirred behind a tree to my right. A flicker of motion, a glint of metal, and the familiar hum of trouble disguised as curiosity. The man had the kind of coat that made you wonder if he'd lost a bet or just didn't care. Threadbare, collar up, sleeves a little too long, and shoulders that hadn't seen a hanger in years. The camera, though, was the opposite. An old-school Rolleiflex that gleamed like it had been polished with reverence. He was crouched, framing a shot of a grave marker that belonged to a flick to the ID, then back to my face. For a full 2 seconds, we stood in a respectable silence. "You following me?" he asked, voice hushed and hoarse, like he hadn't used it much on people. "Not until just now," I said. "But you've stirred interest in someone who prefers not to be stirred." "I don't know what you're talking about." "That makes 2 of us," I said. "So why don't we—" He bolted. No warning, no theatrical gasp, just turned on his heel and launched himself across the lawn like the world's most paranoid sprinter. I started after him, but he had a head start and track shoes built into his adrenaline. I reached the row where he'd crouched and found a manila envelope flung halfway into a patch of ornamental grass. I scooped it up. Inside was a collection of black and white prints, and one in particular that made my eyebrows try to exit my forehead. Mr. Rolleiflex had been digging into something that smelled like trouble. Back at the car, I flipped through the photos like a dealer counting cards. The first few showed graves, 5 to be exact, from different angles, close-ups of inscriptions, wide shots. One even included a tape measure laid across the base of a headstone. Either the guy was into extremely niche art, or he had a system. Then came the blueprints. They weren't copies. They were photographs of originals, likely taken in a hurry under poor lighting. A few were labelled in old architectural shorthand, but one had a red circle drawn right over the centre of a floor plan. My guess? That red circle marked something no one was supposed to find. Next came a street map. Old, maybe pre-war, The same red ink had drawn a pentagon across it, connecting 5 different blocks, one of them near Midtown. Then the last photo. It was grainy but unmistakable. Raymond Martindale, alive, in a hard hat, smiling, standing in front of a building that looked like it had a few secrets of its own. I didn't need Wolfe to tell me this was no amateur sleuth. Whoever our photographer was, he was either brilliant, suicidal, or both. And he just made himself target number 1. Wolfe didn't rise from his chair when I entered. He never does. But his eyes slid up the moment he saw the envelope in my hand. I tossed it gently on his desk like it was holding nitroglycerin, then sat down and waited. He opened it, withdrew the photographs, and sifted through them with the same care Fritz uses when slicing truffles. When he reached the blueprint, he paused. His lips tightened. "This is 47th Street," he said. "West Side, near 8th Avenue. You sure?" "I do not guess," he snapped. This was the Whitlock building, demolished in January. The address was 348 West 47th, a singularly unremarkable structure. Unremarkable with a vault in it. Wolfe frowned. "Possibly. The footprint here is unusual. Narrower in front, wider at the rear. Odd for its zoning class." He examined the map. "These 5 points form a pentagon. That is not coincidence. Neither is a dead architect buried with a map." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. His mind was moving fast, and I could tell something had clicked. But the interruption was already on its way, in the form of rapid footsteps from the hall, and a voice that did not sound calm. Theodore Horstman didn't knock. He burst in like a messenger from the front lines, pale, winded, and clutching a clipboard like it was shielding him from gunfire. "Mr. Wolfe," he gasped. Wolfe lifted his eyes. "Yes?" "It's gone," Theodore wheezed. "Another one." "Which?" "The Pathiopedilum villosum, section 4, right side of the east panel. I checked this morning. It was there." Wolfe didn't move. His face settled into something glacial. "2 thefts," he said softly. "Both rare. Both irreplaceable. And 1 brass case, buried with a dead man." He nodded. "Yes, buried, and now likely unearthed. You think the same hand is responsible?" "Possibly, or the same motive." I stood. "So we've got graves, flowers, maps, and a guy who runs when photographed." "Indeed," Wolfe said. Outside the window, a taxi honked twice, sharp like punctuation. Inside, Wolfe sank deeper into thought, and I knew better than to interrupt him when the silence had purpose. But purpose was about to make a phone call. The phone rang just after 6. Wolfe didn't move, which meant it was mine to grab. "Goodwin, it's Saul," came the quiet voice. "I followed Lochner last night. Thought you'd want to know." "Always." He met with our grave-hopping friend. "The guy with the camera?" "Yep. Same coat, same walk." They talked near the ferry dock for 5 minutes. No handshake, just a manila envelope and some sharp words. "You get close?" Close enough to hear Lochner say, "You think you're the only one who knows where the vault is." Then he took the envelope. "And after?" Lochner left, took a cab. Photographer headed east. Lochner reappeared an hour later near Pier 23. "At the East River?" "Yeah, dumped something into it. Heavy, wrapped in cloth." I frowned. "You sure?" "I'm sure," Saul said. "Whatever it was, he didn't want it found." "Too bad for him," I said. When I hung up, Wolfe was watching me. "Well?" he asked. I gave him the short version. He didn't nod, didn't frown, just reached for his beer. The game was on, and someone had just made their first mistake. The average Wednesday morning doesn't begin with Inspector Kramer trying to knock down our front door. But that day wasn't shaping up as average. The first thud rattled the stained glass. The second one almost made Fritz spill coffee in the front hall, which would have been grounds for homicide. I opened the door, and there he was. Red-faced, hair like a stirred haystack, and breath visibly steaming despite the mild weather. "You working the Lochner case?" he barked.
I gave him a long look. "Hello to you too, Inspector." "Don't get cute, Goodwin." "Where's Wolfe?" "In his chair. Where else?" I led him in. Wolfe didn't rise, he rarely does, but his eyebrows went up the way they do when he's preparing to be insulted by the presence of authority. Kramer got straight to it. "You know Julian Lochner?" Wolfe folded his hands. "Only by reputation, which is to say, distaste." "Well," Kramer grunted, "his reputation just died in Midtown, along with the rest of him. That got Wolfe's attention, and mine. He didn't ask for details. He waited for them like a judge who already suspects the verdict." Kramer helped himself to the red leather chair like he was paying rent. "Body was found this morning. Maintenance crew showed up to prep the interior for final demolition and found Lochner in the back room. Head bashed in." Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. "Cause of death?" Kramer snorted. "Blunt force trauma. Someone played hammer and ditto with his skull. No wallet, no ID. But a valet stub in his coat put him at the Gramercy Club last night. And the building? Scheduled for teardown. Locked up tight. No sign of forced entry at the main door, which means someone either had a key or knew the trick." Wolfe's fingers tapped the armrest. "May I ask why you're here, Inspector?" "I don't visit you for your coffee." "Evidently." Kramer leaned forward. "Lochner had ties to a lot of dirty construction money, and some of those connections lead to your client's dead husband. You working this?" Wolfe didn't blink. "At present, I am engaged to examine the disturbance of a grave. If that leads to Lochner's skull, I will inform you." Kramer muttered something I won't repeat, but he didn't leave. Saul and I met outside the building in Midtown an hour later. It was one of those anonymous pre-war boxes with just enough charm to make the wrecking crew feel guilty. Dust coated the interior like a film set waiting on extras. The only new footprints were from the uniforms who'd taped off the scene. "Cops were in and out already," Saul murmured, "but I saw the blueprints. Vault's supposed to be somewhere in back." We skirted past the blood-marked concrete where Lochner had got bunker. Stone walls, no windows, and that special kind of silence you only get from rooms that used to matter. The floor was concrete, cracked in places, and someone had done a number on what was left of an old iron safe in the far corner. "Someone beat us here," Saul said, crouching beside a bent crowbar. "Lochner? Maybe. But if he found anything, someone else found him." The safe had been pried open with something heavier than your average tool set. Inside was empty. No papers, no cash. Just a few splinters of what might have been wooden drawers. All of it coated in old rust and fresh dust. But over near the ladder, about 2 feet from the base, I spotted a dark stain that hadn't had time to dry completely. Saul bent down, sniffed once, and frowned. "Blood," he said. "Recent." Beside it, a partial shoe print. "Men's size 10, sharp heel, dress shoe, Lochner," I said. He came down, and someone followed. We didn't speak after that. We both knew it. Someone had beaten us to the prize, and Lochner had gotten the worst kind of receipt. We were just about ready to climb out when Saul froze and pointed. There, on the far back wall, above the spot where the safe had been bolted down, was a message written in thick white chalk. Not sloppy, not rushed. Straight block lettering, evenly spaced. "You cannot bury guilt." I stared at it a moment. "Well," I said. "That's subtle." Saul didn't smile. "Someone took their time, not a panic scribble. It's not just a statement," I said. "It's a signature." Saul reached into his jacket and pulled out his camera. "You think Wolfe's going to want a copy? He's going to want 12. I jotted the phrase in my book. The chalk was fresh, maybe an hour old, which meant whoever wrote it had either watched Lochner die or had killed him slow enough to leave a message afterward. Either way, we weren't dealing with a nervous amateur. We climbed out in silence. Back in the office, I gave Wolfe the rundown while he worked his way through a cold bottle of Remmers and stared at his orchids like they were under investigation. He listened, which is Wolfe speak for no interruptions, no sarcasm, just that little crease between his eyes that deepens when death has taken a turn toward the poetic. "Nothing in the safe?" he asked. "Nothing but air and rust. And the message?" I showed him the photo. He didn't flinch. "The hand is careful. Letters are controlled. It was meant to be seen. By who? By whomever follows," he said. He took another sip, then glanced at the orchid wall. 2 plants had been rotated. I doubted anyone else would have noticed, but Wolfe had. "Mr. Goodwin," he said softly, "we are now dealing with a pattern." "I gathered that," I said. "Wanting to call Saul?" "Not yet," he murmured. His eyes didn't leave the orchids, and I got the feeling the next move would come to us. But someone beat us to it. At 6:58, just before Fritz called us in for dinner, the bell rang again. This time no pounding, just a crisp chime, the kind you hear in mortuaries and overpriced dental offices. The man who entered was around 50, wearing a dark suit that had been pressed by someone with anger issues. His shoes were shiny enough to see your sins in, and the cologne he wore could have violated zoning laws. "I'm Enzo Fossey," he said, voice cracking on the first syllable. "I manage the Martindale family plot. Calvary." Wolfe gestured to the red chair. Fossey sat like the cushion might bite him. "I didn't know if I should come," he began, fidgeting with a handkerchief. "But something's been bothering me." "Speak," Wolfe said. 2 nights ago, I saw a man digging at Mr. Martindale's grave, after hours. I didn't report it." "Why not?" I asked. He swallowed. "Because I knew it wasn't vandalism. It was surgical, and I think I recognized the man." That got Wolfe's full attention, and mine. Dinner could wait. If Enzo Fossey thought I wasn't going to follow him the day after he dropped a corpse-digging confession into our laps, he had a higher opinion of his discretion than I did. Fortunately, his scent preceded him. Reserved for surgical tools. I didn't need a warrant to know Fossey had handed off something he didn't want traced. Whatever was in that envelope, it wasn't condolences. From the law office, Fossey made a beeline to Harlem. I trailed him at a casual half-block distance, which wasn't hard. He moved like a man carrying invisible bricks. His next stop was Mendoza & Sons Floral, a boutique so small the & Sons part probably lived in the basement. I parked across the street, pretending to read a copy of the Daily News, while watching Fossey disappear into a riot of lilies, roses, and funereal whispers. The shop catered to upscale farewells, wreaths that cost more than tombstones. I'd been there once on a case involving a poisoned corsage, and the owner, Mr. Mendoza, had the memory of a guppy and the pricing structure of a jewel thief. Fossey emerged with nothing but a receipt, which he carefully folded and slid into his inner coat pocket like it was a confession. He didn't buy flowers, which meant he wasn't sending anything, he was retrieving. If Fossey's day had a theme, it was quiet delivery. Documents, money, or secrets. But back at the brownstone, someone had delivered something of their own. And this time it smelled like trouble, specifically with truffles. I hadn't even hung up my coat when Fritz came charging from the kitchen, like I'd just kicked his soufflé. "Mr. Goodwin," he gasped. Something terrible has occurred." "Relax, Fritz." He pointed dramatically toward the pantry. "Come, look." I followed him in. The pantry smelled like basil and old secrets. He opened the larder cabinet, reached to the top shelf, and pointed with the solemnity of a coroner. "The jar," he said. "The Tartufo Bianco. Gone." I blinked. "The sealed one. The one Mr. Wolfe has been aging since autumn. No one touches that jar. Not even me." "Well," I said, "either someone got bold, or they got stupid." Fritz's face turned grave. "We are not speaking of common truffles. These were from Alba. I'm aware. Wolfe described them once as gustatory justice in fungus form."
Fritz looked near tears. "You must tell him." "You tell him." "He will think I—" "Fine, I'll do it." And I did. Wolfe didn't shout, which meant it was worse. I delivered the news about the missing truffles like I was serving a subpoena. Wolfe, to his credit, didn't bellow. He didn't sigh. He didn't even reach for the bell cord. He just sat there, eyes half-lidded, lips compressed, index fingers tapping the armrest in quiet, time-bomb rhythm. I said, "You want me to call a locksmith or an exorcist?" Silence. "Maybe one of the orchids took a liking to fungus." Nothing. "Just checking," I added. "You skipping rage and going straight to vengeance?" His eyelids lifted a millimeter. "Silence," he said, "is not absence, it is preparation," which, in Wolfe's dialect, meant someone was going to pay, and possibly not in cash. I left him to his pre-eruption contemplation and did what any good assistant would do. Started digging. And what I found didn't involve fungus, but it definitely stank. I spent the afternoon elbow-deep in real estate filings, back issues of the Ledger, and one especially hostile clerk in the zoning office. Martindale's name turned up in half a dozen property transfers from the 1980s, all above board. But buried between the lines was a juicier trail. In 1989, Martindale's firm submitted plans for a high-rise in a residential zone. A month later, the zone changed. Nobody blinked. But behind the paperwork, letters to the zoning board, all countersigned by a name that hadn't come up in years. Orrin Dallas. At the time, Dallas was just a consultant, by which they meant the guy who made envelopes go away. A year later, an anonymous tip accused Martindale and Dallas of bribery. The investigation fizzled out, no charges filed, but Martindale walked away from the project and never worked with Dallas again. I pulled the file, made copies, and filed it all under interesting if you've ambition that turns inconvenient relatives into fond memories. I brought the dossier back to Wolfe. He scanned the page, sniffed once, and muttered, "Of course, Senator Sleaze himself," I said. Wolfe didn't laugh. "Have Saul and Fred begin inquiries," he said, quietly. "When?" He looked at the orchids, then back at me. "Now." And Saul's call came just in time. At exactly 8:12 p.m., the phone rang. I picked it up on the second buzz. "Goodwin, it's Saul. I'm listening. I found your cemetery ghost." That got my spine to straighten. "And? Name's Harlan Depp, former NYPD crime scene archivist. Specialized in photographic forensics. Left the department about 6 months ago. Voluntarily?" Saul paused. "Let's say mutually agreed silence." He filed an internal complaint. Claimed a senior city official tampered with photographic evidence in a land fraud investigation. "Let me guess," I said. "Orrin Dallas." "Bingo." "And after that?" "Disappeared. Dropped out of his apartment lease. No known job. Started showing up in cemeteries 2 months ago. Photographing graves tied to old zoning witnesses." I let out a low whistle. "Sounds like Depp's building a case. Or burying one," Saul said. Either way, someone noticed. I thanked him and hung up. Wolfe already had his eyes on me when I turned. "Well?" he asked. "Harlan Depp," I said. "Ex-cop. Ghost with a camera. And he's got a list." Wolfe nodded once. And I knew what came next. Gloves off. When Saul Panzer calls you before breakfast, it usually means somebody's dead, missing, or both. That morning, it was column C. Dead. Dead. Definitely not missing. And definitely not breathing. We hoofed it to Harlan Depp's place in the East 90s. An apartment that probably hadn't seen a dust rag since disco, and it had been upgraded with a decor style I'd call ransacked by regret. The door was ajar, which is never how you want to find a man who used to catalogue police evidence for a living. Inside, the place looked like someone had been playing hide-and-seek with a sledgehammer. Drawers overturned, closet gutted. We found him face down near the radiator, neck at an angle that chiropractors dream about. One shoe was missing. His glasses were still on, and the expression on his face was the kind that made Saul mutter. He saw it coming. Whoever had come looking for answers found something else. A witness who couldn't talk back. You know the phrase adding insult to injury? This one added horticulture to homicide. Pinned to the lapel of Harlan Depp's corduroy blazer was a flower. Not the usual funeral home carnation, or the kind you buy on Valentine's Day if you're bad at apologies. This was black. Not dark purple, not maroon. Black, like a moonless alley, with edges that curled like a sneer. Saul crouched beside the body and gave it a squint. You think this means something? I shook my head. Could mean anything. A calling card, a message, or just a sick sense of style. We took a few snapshots. Depp's cold face, the ransacked chaos, and the strange blossom front and center. I bagged it and got it to Wolfe like it was a sacred scroll. He didn't touch it, of course. He eyed it through his rimless spectacles like it had insulted his mother. A hoax, he declared. A confection. This is not a naturally occurring orchid. It is fabricated, dyed, starved of light, distorted. A floral pastiche with homicidal flair. In Wolfe's world, making an orchid was just one step below murder. Kramer barreled into the brownstone half an hour later, his tie already askew, and his forehead glistening like it had been in a wrestling match with a subway vent. You want to explain this flower freak show? He barked, jabbing a meaty finger at the bagged orchid on Wolfe's desk. Wolfe didn't look up. If you have a coherent question, Inspector, phrase it in the form of a sentence. The archivist's dead, Kramer growled. Neck snapped like celery. And he's got one of your botanical calling cards on him. You're telling me that's just a coincidence? Wolfe sighed, leaned back in his chair, and folded his hands as if about to bless a congregation. I have not conducted an extrajudicial horticultural outreach, if that's what you imply. The flower...
Sugar Wolf scowled at her from his chair. Archie, a pillow under her head. Fritz, a compress. And if either of you dares offer brandy, you will be shot on sight. When she came to, her voice was a whisper lined with gravel. That flower, it was on the grave too. I thought it was just decoration. Miss, Wolfe said grimly, nothing about this case is decorative. You know things are getting biblical when Nero Wolfe skips dinner. Fritz had outdone himself. Roast duck, glazed with orange and ginger, stuffed with wild rice and almonds. The aroma alone could make a man cry. Wolfe took one whiff, gave it the kind of sigh you reserve for great literature torn in half, and waved it away. No, he said. Remove it. Fritz's moustache twitched like a violin string. But, Monsieur Wolfe, it is your favorite. I have no appetite, Wolfe intoned, not in the face of such desecration. He turned back to the orchids in the plant rooms, rows of delicate, perfect things that had never lied, never murdered, never scribbled guilt in chalk or dyed themselves for melodrama. I left him there, bathed in greenhouse humidity, not moving, not speaking, barely blinking. The kind of silence that felt like thunder under glass. Whatever thoughts were taking root in Wolfe's head, I knew one thing. He wasn't just thinking anymore. He was plotting. By the time the roast duck had cooled to the temperature of betrayal, Wolfe summoned the troops. Fred showed up first, wearing a herringbone coat that needed less starch and more soul. Saul followed, eyes already scanning the room like the crime was hiding behind the curtains. Ori brought the scent of cheap aftershave and an appetite for action. Wolfe didn't rise. He didn't greet. He just pointed. 3 sealed envelopes, 3 pairs of raised eyebrows, one unmistakable tone of war. You will not open them until you reach your respective destinations, he said. Inside, your assignments, tailored to your aptitudes. Be discreet, efficient, and unsentimental.
Fred looked curious. Saul looked bored. Ori looked like Christmas came early. As they filed out, Wolfe turned to me and muttered, "We are no longer unarmed." I nodded. "And the target?" He didn't answer, just tapped the edge of his armchair twice. Whatever came next wasn't going to be passive. Wolfe had declared botanical war. Some guys spend their weekends at ball games. Me? I spent mine elbow deep in microfilm reels and graveyard registries, trying not to sneeze on 50 years of dust and municipal cover-ups. The photographs, 5 of them, showed 5 gravestones as bland as old oatmeal. No flowers, no plastic angels, just names, dates, and the quiet kind of stone that says someone wanted them forgotten. But paper remembers what people don't. The first name, a warehouse foreman, died in 73. He'd once testified against Martindale's company for illegal dumping in the East River. The second, a retired accountant who'd done audits for Dallas's old construction firm, until he dropped dead mid-spreadsheet. The third was a tenant association leader who vanished after a heated zoning battle. 4 and 5 were similar vintage, a city clerk and a paralegal. All crossed paths with either Martindale or Dallas, then mysteriously took a dirt nap shortly after. Coincidence? Maybe if you believe roulette wheels have favourite numbers. I filed the clippings, tucked the printouts into Wolfe's morning stack, and started a fresh pot of coffee. Because the dead were whispering, and we were finally listening. Mapping graves isn't exactly a hobby I recommend, but when 5 people all croak after poking the same hornet's nest, you learn to get out your compass and connect the dots, literally. I laid out the city map on Wolfe's globe-sized desk, pinned the graveyard coordinates with red thumbtacks, and stood back. The pattern didn't scream at you, it whispered. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. A 5-pointed star. Not your typical satanic doodle, but geometrically flawless. The graves formed a perfect pentagon, one that spanned borough lines and decades, like someone had been playing the long. Most of the headstones are rubble, but they kept the ledgers. I was already halfway out of my chair. And one crypt leased in perpetuity by, wait for it, Roland Martindale. No listed occupant, just a purchase date. 1946. Right after that zoning war you mentioned. That got Wolfe's attention. He was halfway through a bottle of Horlicks when he froze like a gargoyle. "Describe the crypt," he barked. Fred grunted. "Sealed, no entry, mortared shut, thick as city corruption. Groundskeeper says nobody's been near it in 50 years. I relayed it all to Wolfe, who sat back like he'd just heard the final note in a long-lost symphony. "It is not a resting place," he said slowly. "It is a vault." And Martindale, it seemed, had been burying more than just people. Wolfe hates mess, mental or otherwise. But by the time we hit late afternoon, he had pages spread across his desk like an academic exorcism. Municipal records, cemetery maps, zoning filings, even a faded floor plan of Martindale's midtown office. The pieces clicked, one by one, like tumblers in a lock. "He did not destroy the evidence," Wolfe muttered. "He distributed it. Fragmented. Hid it in plain sight. Each plot, a storage cell, a time capsule of guilt." I offered him a beer. He declined it like I'd handed him swamp water. He was past beer. He was in the zone. Harlan Depp, he went on, had begun to suspect the code. His background in archival records would have made the grave connections visible. I wager he was preparing to exhume. Not metaphorically, but physically. "He started digging up secrets," I said, "and got himself buried." Wolfe slammed a fist down, not hard, but enough for a paperweight to shiver. "Insufferable," he growled. That man turned my city into a puzzle box, and now, he narrowed his eyes. Now we open it. While Wolfe was orchestrating Botanical war, I was on the horn with every greenhouse in 3 boroughs. The black orchid wasn't just rare, it was practically mythical. But a certain hybrid, cultivated in the 30s by Martindale himself, had made 2 appearances in city records. 2 recipients. 1. Eleanor Martindale, the long-suffering wife with a penchant for vintage brooches and silence. 2. Senator Orrin Dallas. When I dropped the bomb on Wolfe, he didn't flinch, just muttered. He gave them tokens of loyalty, orchids born from control. I raised a brow. So now we've got murder bouquets with a signature. Yes, Wolfe said grimly, and the killer is writing in flowers. Blackmail wasn't the root, it was the stem. Someone had taken Martindale's secrets, buried them, and passed on the blooms like a curse. And the petals were starting to fall. Wolfe doesn't stand often, but when he does, the air changes. That night, just after 9, he rose from his throne like a judge who'd heard enough lies. He pointed at the phone like it owed him rent. Archie, summon them. Everyone? He nodded. All who orbit this constellation of deceit. Sylvia, Dallas, Mrs. Martindale, Kramer, the inspector's ego, if it fits through the door. Tomorrow, 11 o'clock. That's soon, I asked. He turned, slow and deliberate. This game is not chess. It is poker, and I am calling. I made the calls. Some grumbled. Some hesitated. One pretended to lose signal. But they'd come, because Wolfe wasn't asking. And when the curtain rose the next morning, every seat in the office would be filled. Every lie on the table. And someone, finally, would fold. By 4 o'clock, the office looked less like a room and more like a chessboard with 6 too many pawns. Wolfe had them arranged just so. Dallas in the red chair near the bookshelves, Fossey on the green leather to the left, Sylvia beside the orchids, which Wolfe called symbolic with a grunt, and Vincennes across from the globe. I, naturally, played butler in arms, armed with a silver tray and a smirk. I prefer chairs with meaning, Archie, Wolfe muttered. Those assembled ought to be seated in accordance with their guilt. I left the electric chairs at home, I said, pouring the first round of coffee like a priest offering the sacrament, minus the mercy. Fossey sniffed his cup as if a man who prized discretion over justice. In 1949, he buried more than people. He buried evidence, documents, relics, embarrassments. I piped in for the audience, like a twisted Easter egg hunt, only with murder. He ignored me. Each interment was deliberate. Each location chosen with a symbolic flourish. A pentagon, not for aesthetics, for concealment. It was meant to encode guilt geometrically. I glanced at Fossey, who now looked like geometry gave him ulcers. Wolfe leaned forward, which for him is the equivalent of a striptease. But someone decoded it and started digging, and just like that the room dropped 10 degrees. Gentlemen, Wolfe said, and lady, though I use the term in its broadest application, there was one error, one botanical betrayal. He turned slightly toward the orchid tray near the window, where Fritz had replaced the missing bloom just this morning with a substitute. Wolfe gave it a contemptuous glance, as if the plant had personally insulted his waistline. A hybrid black orchid, he said, bred from the Dendrobium genus and marked with a twisting petal signature I invented myself. One was stolen from my conservatory 2 nights ago. That got a stir. Even Dallas blinked. And? Fossey asked, sweating like he knew where this was going. Wolfe's tone was now ivory cold, and it appeared in Mr. Harlan Depp's apartment, pinned to his corpse like a business card from a very exclusive florist. Sylvia inhaled sharply. I couldn't blame her. Which means, Wolfe went on, that someone in this room violated both the sanctity of my home and the sanctity of horticultural ethics. The former I can forgive, the latter never. The silence that followed had teeth. It was a fine moment for a poker table. Sylvia's fingers trembled on her cup. Her face had gone paler than a midtown waiter's tip jar after the lunch crowd. When she finally set it down, it clinked loud enough to startle herself. Fossey, meanwhile, had gone from pink to parboiled. Beads of sweat were clustering on his forehead like votes at a rigged election. His handkerchief got more action than a subway rail.
And Vincenz? The man sat motionless, his lips pressed together like he was holding a Latin hymn hostage. He looked like he'd heard it all before, and hadn't liked it the first time, either. Wolfe, naturally, was enjoying himself in the most civilized way possible, by watching them squirm, with the serene detachment of a Roman senator watching gladiators bleed. I had my eyes on Sylvia. She looked like one word, one wrong syllable, might send her straight into a swoon. Wolfe was winding the clock. The spring was nearly tight. Dallas had been sitting still, too still, for Wolfe's whole pageant. When the second orchid photo came out, though, something in his jaw twitched. Then came the blink. Then the sudden rise. This is outrageous, he snapped, reaching for his coat like a man catching a train to freedom. Senator, Wolfe said mildly, do sit. But the door was already halfway open, and Dallas halfway through it, when something unexpected happened. Fritz, our very own culinary artist, emerged from the hall like a pastry-powered linebacker and swept one leg forward with a precision that would have earned applause from a Vienna ballet instructor. Dallas hit the carpet with a grunt that wasn't senatorial. I moved fast, not to tackle him, but to yank the door shut and make sure it stayed that way. Fritz gave a slight bow and said, I apologize. He appeared unwell. Wolfe didn't even blink. Archie, do ensure he remains seated this time. I believe the next remark may interest him. Oh, it did. Wolfe rose from his chair like a storm cloud forming over a courthouse. For a man who detests movement, when he does stand, it's practically biblical. I abhor violence, he said, voice rich with disdain. But I despise cowardice even more. He locked eyes with Dallas, now upright and dusted, but far from dignified. You buried truth like coffins. You coerced, manipulated, and when that failed, you killed. And when you couldn't kill fast enough, you tried to run. Wolfe's voice was low now. Deadly. I do not convict. That is the role of the state. But I expect strategy now. If you don't move, maybe the truth won't see you. Wolfe turned slightly toward the others. The chain began with Mr. Martindale, a man who preferred discretion to decency. In 1949, he buried documents that would have ruined reputations, his and others. Among them was a confidential letter regarding a chemical spill at a military facility, falsified death records, and an appropriations memo marked "Destroy after reading." He buried it. Literally, I added, with a shovel, not a conscience. Mr. Lochner, the late civil servant turned hobbyist cryptographer, discovered the burial pattern encoded through cemetery registries. Dallas learned of this, likely through campaign surveillance, and used both funds and pressure to enlist Lochner's assistance. Wolfe paused. Then he eliminated him. The silence trembled on that word like a tripwire. Lochner, Wolfe continued, was greedy, but not stupid. He made copies. He also made the mistake of trusting Harlan Depp, a graduate student with an inconvenient habit of asking questions. I chipped in, especially the kind that gets you killed. Wolfe gave me the look, that glacier-browed glance that says,
Don't interrupt art. I yielded, but with flair. Depp, he said, began cross-referencing Lochner's notes with municipal grave permits. He suspected something symbolic. He was correct. And Dallas, I offered, started to sweat. Indeed. Wolfe's voice curled like smoke. Senator Dallas could not risk an exposé. Not with re-election on the horizon, and 2 skeletons, one buried, one breathing, in his filing cabinet. So he employed theatrics, the stolen orchid, the symbolic placement. Each crime a twisted epistle. He pointed a thick finger at the dried orchid on the table. A warning, a signature, a ritual. Dallas shifted, just once. The kind of twitch you make when your collar starts to feel like a noose. Wolfe said, when a man uses flowers as murder's calling card, he has long since abandoned reason. That was putting it politely.
It might have ended there, Wolfe said, had a widow not come knocking.
Sylvia had her eyes on the floor. She hadn't said a word since Wolfe began his lecture, and I got the impression she wasn't planning to start now. Mrs. Depp, Wolfe said, folding his hands over his considerable middle, came to me bearing 2 things, a grief-laced suspicion and a napkin stained with orchid pollen. That had been my find, not that Wolfe would say so. Her presence agitated Mr. Dallas. Her inquiry reached Mr. Fossey, who made a futile attempt to redirect her to safer distractions. But the momentum of truth, once nudged, gathers speed. Sylvia finally looked up. "You think I caused—" "No, madam," Wolfe said gently. "You didn't cause the fire. You opened the window for once." I had nothing snappy to add. The silence that followed didn't belong to any one of us. It just hung there, waiting for something honest. Kramer had spent the last 20 minutes leaning against the far wall like he was trying to merge with the paint job. When Wolfe wrapped up the logic with a final damning reference to a bank wire and a graveyard timestamp, the big man finally spoke. "Damn it, Wolfe," he muttered. "You nailed it." I almost dropped my pen. Wolfe didn't flinch, but I swear his left eyebrow acknowledged it. "That," Wolfe said dryly, "would appear to be the closest approximation of praise within your capabilities." Kramer grunted, took a step forward, then pulled out the pair of cuffs that had been itching his pocket for an hour. "Dallas, you're coming with me." Dallas didn't argue. He looked like a man already rehearsing his press statement, probably involving witch hunt and deep regret. As they left, Wolfe reached for his beer with a sigh that sounded like justice had interrupted his digestion. Once the door clicked behind Kramer, Dallas, and the shadow of Washington politics, Wolfe exhaled. A rare, full exhale. The kind he usually reserves for decanting Burgundy or untying his shoelaces. He rose. "Fritz has truffles. Warm. I'll alert the Pulitzer Committee," I said. But he was already out the door. 5 minutes later, I heard the kitchen clatter. "Thank you for not calling me a liar." "Don't thank me yet," I said. "We're billing you tomorrow." She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes, but it tried. As she stepped out, something fluttered from her purse. A handkerchief, pale linen, neatly embroidered with a yellow oncidium. I bent to pick it up, but she was already gone. I held the thing like it meant something, which it probably did. Wolfe would see it as a gesture, a cipher. I saw it as a quiet goodbye from a woman who'd buried too much to speak plainly. I didn't close the door all the way. That night, around 11:03, Wolfe buzzed me from the dining room. I was halfway through a crossword and 3/4 through a ginger ale. "Yes, sir," I said. He didn't look up from the plate. "Did you ever locate the 5th black orchid?" I leaned against the doorway. "No." He nodded once. "Curious," he said. "They're not easy to lose." I could have made a crack. I could have said maybe it sprouted legs and joined a monastery. But I didn't. "Maybe," I said, "it found peace." Wolfe glanced up at me then. One of those brief flashes where his eyes had something in them besides scorn for humanity. "Unlikely," he said. But he didn't push it. The city, of course, moved on. Subways rattled, headlines churned, and somewhere uptown another man buried another secret under concrete and excuses. But in that brownstone on 35th Street, with orchids overhead and truffle crumbs on the plate, something had settled. Not forgiveness, not justice exactly, but truth. And in this town, that's rare enough to count. In a city that never sleeps, some secrets only rest when they're buried twice. Once in the grave, and once in the truth. In the end, justice didn't roar. It whispered. A trail of orchids, stitched linen, and silence carried the truth to its final resting place. The senator ran. The widow wept. And Wolfe returned to his truffles as if he had merely adjusted a crooked picture frame on the wall of civilization. The blackmail, the graves, the coded blooms, all of it faded into memory, except for the one question that